They excavated beneath Al-Aqsa Mosque and uncovered a hidden treasure that in an astonishingly brief span of time propelled them like an arrow skyward, transforming them from a humble monastic organization of 9 impoverished knights, reliant on alms and donations from the pilgrims and travelers they protected, into one of the wealthiest organizations in the world and among the most influential powers in history from that day to this. They became the spearhead of the Crusades, and with their own hands, redrew the boundaries of the world and its history. Following the victory of the Muslim Seljuks over the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in the late 11th century, the influence of the Orthodox Byzantine Empire gradually receded in Asia Minor. Sensing the impending threat advancing from the east, the Catholics of Western Europe grew increasingly alarmed. It became evident that the Byzantine state would not withstand the pressure for long and would be unable to shield Europe from the Eastern Front. In response to an appeal by the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, Pope Urban II convened a meeting with the French nobility, urging them to wage war against the Muslims in the East under the pretext of liberating Christian churches from the hands of infidels and pagans, as he phrased it. At the ecclesiastical council held in the French city of Clermont-Ferrand, he delivered a powerful and eloquent sermon, emphasizing the imperative of freeing the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Resurrection, from Muslim control. He promised the warriors that their journey eastward and their war against the Muslims would earn them complete absolution of their sins. Thus, religion was manipulated, laying the groundwork for what became known as indulgences, and the war was cloaked in deceptive righteousness so as not to conflict with the peaceful and tolerant essence of Christianity. He branded it a holy war. His call successfully ignited the ambitions of nobles and princes who coveted the wealth of the East, while also stirring the masses who rallied under the banner of religion in hopes of salvation. They stitched the cross onto their garments and prepared themselves for war. In this manner, Urban II sparked the flame of the First Crusade with a declared aim of restoring Christian control over the Holy Lands, though beneath that lay political, colonial, and economic motives. At the same time, Pierre l'Ermite, Peter the Hermit, riding on his donkey, traversed the lands, calling upon the people with his persuasive oratory and charismatic presence to join the sacred campaign. He personally led one of the 5 assembled armies, composed largely of common folk and peasants. Thus, the campaign came to be known as the Crusade of the Poor. To fully grasp the context, one must understand that Europe at that time was immersed in what is known as the Middle Ages, the era that bridged the ancient classical period and the modern age. Spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, the Middle Ages were characterized by the dominance of feudalism, whereby nobles held vast expanses of land and exercised ownership over the people who lived on it. They were known as serfs, meaning slaves of the land. So the vast majority of Europeans were deprived of education and endured dire economic conditions and an exceedingly poor standard of living. Amid such hardship and prevailing ignorance, it was easy to instill any ideology into the minds of the masses, even under the guise of religious doctrine, to serve worldly ambitions and inflame blind fanaticism. European society was starkly stratified, with the knightly class situated in the middle. Thus, bearing arms became a necessity for survival in such harsh and precarious conditions. Meanwhile, the clergy reigned supreme as the spiritual authority, and the possessions of the church were at times equal to or even exceeded those held by kings and princes. Before the campaign began, all participants swore fealty to the Byzantine emperor, pledging to surrender any lands they might seize from the Muslims to him. Under the banner of the cross, The armies marched toward Asia Minor, defeating the Seljuks, who at the time were entangled in internal conflicts. Following a prolonged siege of Antioch, the Crusaders succeeded in capturing it, then continued their advance along the Levantine coast toward Jerusalem, which was under Fatimid rule, and they laid siege to the city. In July 1099, they succeeded in conquering it and unleashed a massacre of horrifying savagery upon its inhabitants. Accounts tell of horses wading through blood and the death toll reaching 100,000, comprising Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians, according to some sources. Yet rather than honor their oath and return the city to the Byzantine emperor, they betrayed their vow and established 4 Crusader states: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, the latter declared the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After that, they erected settlements and extended invitations to Europeans to immigrate and settle there. Thus, the serfs, once bound to the land, became its owners, and the paupers of yesterday turned into lords. Baldwin I was crowned king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which remained under Crusader rule for nearly a century, despite being encircled by the Islamic world. However, that Islamic world was then a fragmented and ailing entity divided between 2 major rival powers: the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital in Baghdad, and the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate, based in Cairo. This was compounded by the complacency and apathy of Muslim rulers, who failed to unite or effectively resist the Crusaders. Thus, the First Crusade prevailed. The Crusaders captured Jerusalem, expanded along the Levantine coast, and seized Nablus, Baisan, Tiberias, Haifa, Arsuf, Acre, Tripoli, Sidon, Beirut, and many other cities. They even attempted to take Aleppo, laying siege to the city. Though the city withstood the siege, its Seljuk governor, Fakhr al-Mulk Radwan, opted for appeasement and submitted to the Crusaders in a bid to safeguard his own position and estates. So much so that he ordered a cross to be erected atop the dome of Aleppo's Grand Mosque, complying with the demands of the Prince of Antioch, Tancred. Public outrage erupted in response to such practices, and the protests were led by Judge Abu al-Fadl ibn al-Khashab, who later traveled to Baghdad to seek military support from the Abbasid Caliphate. Consequently, the Emir of Mosul, Sharaf al-Din Mahmud, marched at the head of an army toward Aleppo and succeeded in lifting the Crusader siege. He then proceeded to Damascus at the request of its Emir, Zahir al-Din Totakan, to aid its people against the assaults launched by the Kingdom of Jerusalem. There, he confronted the forces of Baldwin I in the Battle of Al-Sanabra, south of Tiberias, where Sharaf al-Din Mahmud secured the first significant Muslim victory over the Crusaders. Yet, treachery swiftly claimed him, as he was assassinated by a member of the esoteric sect known as the Assassins. This was an Azari Ismaili Shiite faction founded by Hassan al-Sabah, who forged it into a dagger poised against the back of the Islamic world, relying on betrayal and political assassinations to eliminate their adversaries. Not long afterward, the assassins also murdered Abu al-Fadl ibn al-Khashab in Aleppo, and following the death of its emir, Fakhr al-Mulk Radwan, he was succeeded by Alp al-Din Arslan, who was soon slain by one of his own servants. In Mosul, Emir Izz al-Din Masoud died and was succeeded by a vigorous young prince who would herald a new era in the resistance against the Crusaders, Ahmad al-Din Zengi. He hastened to Aleppo and forged an alliance with it, thus uniting Aleppo and Mosul into a single force that would later rise as the principal bulwark against the Crusaders, until it ultimately vanquished them. At that time, Baldwin I, king of Jerusalem, had died, and he was succeeded by his cousin Baldwin II. The prevailing political instability in the region cast a dark shadow over security. Although the Crusaders maintained a firm grip over Jerusalem itself, the rest of the occupied territories teemed with bandits, and Christian pilgrim caravans were frequently assaulted, plundered, and slain. It was in this climate that a French knight named Hugues de Payens met with Baldwin II and proposed the creation of a monastic military organization tasked with safeguarding the European pilgrims and travelers visiting the Holy Land. Yet this stated mission was but a facade for another, more clandestine objective: the excavation of sacred relics, a practice widespread in that era. However, unlike others who dug haphazardly in the hopes of stumbling upon treasure, their efforts were methodical and purposeful, as if they sought a specific, long-hidden artifact. Baldwin II approved the proposal, and in the year 1120, the organization was founded by 9 knights as an extension of the Organization of Malta or the Knights Hospitaller, which had been established either in 1050 or 1099, according to differing sources, by Italian merchants as a charitable institution to aid Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, akin to the Knights of St. John. Originally established as a charitable organization, they gradually evolved into a military religious order, combining medical missions with combat roles against Islamic forces. The new organization established its headquarters atop the Temple Mount within the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a site referred to by Jews as the Temple of Solomon. From this, the members dubbed themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, later known more succinctly as the Knights Templar. Not long thereafter, Baldwin II passed away and was succeeded on the throne of the Kingdom of Jerusalem by his son-in-law Fulk. Following Fulk's death, his eldest son, Baldwin III, ascended the throne. Meanwhile, Imad al-Din Zengi, having succeeded in uniting Mosul and Aleppo, sought to annex Damascus. However, its ruler, Main al-Din Anar, who had succeeded Zahir al-Din Totakan, rejected Zengi's ambitions and aligned himself with the Crusaders. Thus, in the year 1144, Zengi turned his attention toward Edessa with the intention of reclaiming it. The Crusader ruler of the city, Jocelyn, responded by strengthening its fortifications and resolutely preparing for its defense. To outmaneuver him, Zengi devised a clever stratagem, feigning an expedition against the Kurdish tribes of Diyarbakir, who had refused to align themselves with him. Jocelyn was deceived by the ruse and, believing the threat had passed, relaxed the city's defenses and departed for France. Upon hearing of this, Zengi swiftly descended upon the city, launching a sudden assault. He succeeded in liberating it after 42 years of occupation, making Edessa the first Crusader state to fall and igniting the spark of the Islamic awakening and a revival of the spirit of jihad. Imad al-Din Zengi was hailed as a hero, a beacon of hope upon whom many pinned their aspirations for the recovery of Jerusalem. Yet fate did not grant him time. Treachery reached him as he slept, and he was murdered by his servant. Some say loyal to the Crusaders, others claim he belonged to the assassin sect. Zengi was succeeded by his son, Nur al-Din Mahmud, a young man steeped in asceticism and pious devotion. He adopted jihad as his life's mission, walking in the footsteps of the earliest Muslims. He labored to ensure that the Islamic awakening was rooted in intellectual revival, summoning scholars and jurists and establishing a comprehensive renaissance grounded in the propagation of jihad in the path of God, as the sole means to reclaim the land and elevate the word of truth. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. In response, Pope Eugenius III and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the French abbot and nephew of one of the original 9 Templars, called for a Second Crusade. King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany, along with numerous nobles, answered the call, thus forming the First Crusade to be led by European monarchs. Yet it was a campaign lacking in clarity of vision and purpose, and its forces marched directly toward Damascus, intending to occupy it with the aim of cutting off Nur al-Din Mahmud. This proved to be a grave political miscalculation, for Damascus had maintained amicable relations with the Crusaders of Jerusalem. The siege only deepened the divisions between the leaders of the Second Crusade and the veteran Crusaders who had settled in the region since the First Crusade, further sowing distrust between them and the Damascenes. The people of Damascus, feeling betrayed, dispatched a plea to Nur al-Din, who entered the city honored and welcomed, an ally summoned by divine providence. The Second Crusade soon retreated in disgrace, leaving behind nothing but disappointment. It had, ironically, achieved but one unintended outcome in favor of the Muslims: the expansion of the Islamic front, now unified in Mosul, Aleppo, Edessa, and at last, Damascus. At that time, Baldwin III, king of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, passed away and was succeeded by his brother Amalric I. He was a shrewd, formidable, and astute adversary who quickly realized that Egypt was the linchpin of power. The one who could bring it under his dominion would surely prevail over his rivals. Egypt was then under the waning Fatimid Caliphate. The caliph's role had become purely ceremonial, confined to being mentioned in prayers from the pulpits as a nominal sovereign, while actual governance rested in the hands of his viziers. Amalric's eyes remained fixed on Egypt until an opportunity arose, when the governor of Upper Egypt, Dergham ibn Thalaba, requested his intervention in a struggle for the vizierate against Shahr ibn Mugair. Shahr, having been ousted, had fled to Nur al-Din Mahmud, who responded by dispatching his military commander, Asad al-Din Shirkuh, to support him. Shirkuh was accompanied by his young nephew, Yusuf ibn Shatsi, who was then no more than 16 years old. Shirkuh succeeded in reinstating Shahr, fortifying himself in the city of Bilbis. However, Shahr grew wary of Shirkuh's growing influence, turned against him, and treacherously summoned Amalric to Egypt. Amalric responded by besieging Bilbis for 3 months, until both parties reached an agreement to withdraw from Egypt. But Shahr once again called upon Amalric, prompting Nur al-Din to send Shirkuh once more, accompanied again by his nephew, Yusuf ibn Shatsi. This youth would one day become the sword that would sever the Crusaders' advance, the hammer that would shatter the myth of the Templar Knights in the East, after uniting the armies of Islam, earning fame across both East and West under the name Saladin. Following a series of battles and skirmishes between Muslims and Crusaders on Egyptian soil, Shirkuh finally entered Cairo. He eliminated Shahr and assumed the vizierate under the nominal authority of the Fatimid Caliph. Thus, Egypt effectively became part of the Zengid realm governed by Nur al-Din Mahmud. Upon Shirkuh's death, the Fatimid Caliph entrusted the vizierate to Saladin, who soon solidified his grip over the country despite the conspiracies woven by the power-hungry and the self-interested. King Amalric recognized the shifting balance of power in favor of the Muslims and wrote to the Vatican seeking a new crusade. Yet the monarchs and princes of Europe did not respond. Consequently, he forged an alliance with the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, and together they launched a campaign against Egypt. The Crusader fleet laid siege to the city of Damietta, intending to capture it as a staging ground for a march on Cairo. Saladin dispatched reinforcements to defend the city, and the garrison of Damietta, alongside its people, mounted a valiant resistance, securing victory for the Muslims. The Byzantine fleet withdrew, followed soon after by Amalric's forces. Not long afterward, Amalric died and was succeeded by his son, Baldwin IV, later known as the Leper King due to his affliction with leprosy. After the Battle of Damietta, the rule of Egypt was firmly established for Saladin. He received a request from Nur ad-Din to cease the invocation of the Fatimid Caliph on the pulpits, and instead to invoke the Abbasid Caliph. Soon after, the Fatimid Caliph passed away, and Saladin became the de facto ruler of Egypt. He moved his family and his father Najm ad-Din to Egypt. Thus, the Fatimid rule in Egypt came to an end after 262 years, and Egypt returned to the Abbasid Caliphate under the governance of the Zengid state. 3 years later, in 1174, the Prince Nur ad-Din Mahmud passed away, and his young son Al-Salih Ismail succeeded him with Sa'd ad-Dawla Qamishtakin appointed as his regent. This led to a fierce power struggle among the Zengid princes, forcing Saladin to engage in an internal conflict to settle the matter and unify the banner of the Muslims. Amidst these events, a momentous affair was unfolding in secrecy, marking the early stages of a plan that would last over a millennium. The chapters of this plan have only been revealed by its architects, with much still hidden from the world. It appears that the leaders of the Knights Templar had finally discovered what they had been seeking, returning to France after laying the foundations for an organization that swiftly gained a reputation for its noble cause and the bravery of its warriors. They also gained a voice in the Vatican, the heart of the Christian world, embodied by Saint Bernard Delaware Clairvaux, the head of the French monastery, who had been one of the advocates for the Second Crusade and the nephew of one of the Nine Knights. Bernard supported the organization with all his might, praising the nobility and courage of its knights. He even authored a book titled In Praise of the New Knight, extolling the virtues of the Templars and bolstering their growth, attempting to secure high-level legitimacy for them. His efforts were fruitful, and eventually, he secured the approval and endorsement of the Church for the organization, making the Templars a central recipient of donations and offerings. Wealth flowed to them in the form of money, land, and volunteers, to the point that noble families began sending their sons to join the Templar order, recognized by their white robes adorned with a red cross. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal decree known as the Donation of Perfection, granting the Templars special privileges, including exemption from taxes and immunity from local laws, subject only to the authority of the Pope. Imagine a group in our present time receiving a decree that exempts its members from legal authority. What could they possibly possess to wield such power and influence over ruling authorities, to the extent of being granted immunity from legal accountability? Shortly after the Knights Templar gained official recognition from the Catholic Church in 1129, their influence expanded dramatically, and their ranks swelled at an astonishing rate. According to some sources, their numbers grew to nearly 20,000 members, spread across Europe and the Middle East. They transformed from protectors of pilgrims to an elite force, a strike unit within the Crusader army. They were bound by strict ethical rules, such as chastity, piety, obedience, and avoiding women. Their organizational and military codes were even stricter, with secrecy and an unwavering commitment to never retreat in battle, as death for them was considered a great honor, rewarded with forgiveness and paradise. With these characteristics, their combat doctrine mirrored that of the Muslims, making them known for their bravery and valor. Within a few years, they established branches across Western Europe and possessed a vast fleet of ships. They also created a banking system allowing pilgrims to deposit their funds in their home countries and withdraw them upon reaching the Holy Land, thus safeguarding against theft along the journey. Their acquisition of vast tracts of land, the construction of castles, fortresses, and cathedrals, and their increasing wealth made them akin to a financial institution, a major bank, or an international bank, lending to kings and European nobles. Thus, they gained the ability to influence kings, create laws, and manipulate the destinies of nations to serve their interests, much as we see today. Saladin appointed his brothers Al-Adil Sif ad-Din to rule Egypt and Sif al-Islam to govern Damascus, then set out toward Aleppo, where the Zengid princes had fortified themselves and besieged the city in 1175. However, just as his unification project had enemies abroad, he also faced even greater threats within. In addition to the princes coveting the throne, the assassins harbored intense animosity towards him, especially after he toppled the Shiite Fatimid state in Egypt and established a regime adhering to Sunni principles. At that time, the leader of the assassins, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, conspired with Kamashtakan, and a group of 13 assassins infiltrated Saladin camp in an attempt to assassinate him. However, they failed in their mission. Meanwhile, his enemies among the Zengids launched a smear campaign against him, accusing him of forgetting his roots, portraying him merely as a servant of King Nur ad-Din Mahmud, an unfaithful and treacherous servant who betrayed his lord and denied his past. Saladin responded to these accusations by clarifying that he did not lay siege to Aleppo nor come to Syria except to protect the lands of Islam from the Crusader armies and reclaim what had been taken from the Holy Land. This was a mission that could not be entrusted to a mere boy, one too young to defend the faith and easily manipulated by the malicious. Perhaps now you understand where some of the writings, relied upon by certain mercenaries and narrow-minded individuals in our present time, stem from to distort the image of this great hero. Saladin then led his forces to the city of Hama, swiftly recovering it from the Crusaders, and thereafter defeated the Zengids, reconciling with them and entering Aleppo. Thus, the Muslims united under a powerful and courageous leader, whose clear goal was the liberation of Jerusalem and the expulsion of the Crusaders from all of Islamic lands. Saladin then proclaimed himself king over the territories he had conquered, and the Abbasid Caliph granted him authority over Egypt, the Maghrib, Nubia, the Hijaz, Tahama, Palestine, and central Syria. The imams of the mosques began to call out his name in their sermons as Al-Malik al-Nasir. He then began preparations for his grand project to unify the Muslims under a single banner to confront the Crusaders and remove the threat posed by the Knights Templar from the body of the Islamic world. In the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, the Leper King, planned to strike at Saladin's stronghold in Egypt, seeking support from the Byzantine navy. Meanwhile, his army clashed with the Muslim forces at the Battle of Tel al-Jazar, or the Battle of Ramla, where Saladin suffered a crushing defeat and retreated to Egypt. However, he quickly regained his strength and soon launched successive blows against the Crusaders. In 1190, Baldwin IV advanced his army toward Damascus, where a battle near the Jordan River took place. The Muslims emerged victorious, and the leader of the Knights Templar, along with many high-ranking Crusader knights, was captured. Baldwin IV himself came close to being taken prisoner, but he narrowly escaped. He then sent an offer for a truce to Saladin, which was accepted. Not long after, Baldwin IV passed away, and the Patriarch of Jerusalem crowned Sibylla, Baldwin's sister, as Queen of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. She placed the crown on her husband, Guy de Lusignan, making him king. In 1187, the ruler of the Principality of Antioch, Renaud de Chatillon, known as Arnett, broke the truce and raided a commercial caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. He plundered it, killing and capturing its members. It was rumored that Saladin's sister was among the caravan, but this was never confirmed. Arnett was known for his recklessness, insolence, and brutality, as well as his deep hatred for Islam and Muslims, to the extent that he called on the Crusader Knights to attack Medina and Mecca, exhume the Prophet Muhammad's grave, and demolish the Kaaba, with the aim of humiliating Muslims and distracting Saladin from Jerusalem. He indeed allied with the Knights Templar and sent a fleet across the Red Sea to achieve this goal. However, King Al-Adil Sif ad-Din, Saladin's brother, set out from Egypt with an army and defeated them, returning to Cairo with the fleet's commanders as prisoners. Saladin then issued a decree to execute them as a warning to anyone who might consider repeating such an act. Saladin then sent a letter to the king of Jerusalem, Lusignan, demanding compensation for the damage, the release of the prisoners from the caravan, and accountability for the perpetrator. However, Lusignan, weakened by Arnot's power and influence, failed to respond. Saladin declared a state of mobilization in preparation for a massive battle and swore to personally kill Arnot. He opened the doors for volunteers in Egypt and sent out requests for support to Mosul, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant, calling on them to reinforce his army. The Abbasid Caliph, Al-Nasir li-Din Allah, supported him, commanding the kings in the Islamic lands to assist him with their soldiers and forces. Volunteers poured in from across the Islamic world, and a massive army united under one banner, with a singular goal: to liberate Jerusalem. Saladin began the campaign with a siege of Tiberias, while the Crusaders mustered the largest army they had ever gathered since their arrival in the east, assembling at Sephuria. Their leaders debated whether they should march towards Tiberias to meet the Muslims there or wait for them. Prince Balian Diabolin believed that moving out to face Saladin was a mistake that would result in the army's destruction, leaving Jerusalem defenseless. However, Arnot, known for his recklessness and arrogance, opposed him and insisted on marching towards the Muslims. He was supported in this by the commander of the Knights Templar. So the decision was made to march and confront the Muslim army, which led the Crusaders into a catastrophic mistake. The journey was long, the summer sun relentless, and the water supplies distant. The wells along the route had been filled by the Muslims as part of Saladin's plan to lure them into exhaustion. The Crusaders camped near Hattin, exhausted and thirsty, while the Muslim army camped with the Sea of Galilee behind them, ensuring that the Crusaders could not access water. During the night, some Muslim soldiers infiltrated the Crusader camp and set fire to parts of it, depriving them of sleep and rest. Thus, all the elements for victory came together for the Muslims, with God's help and through meticulous planning. On the morning of the battle, the Crusader army was worn out and fatigued. The takbirs, cries of Allahu Akbar, rang out, shaking the earth, and the Muslims achieved a crushing victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. The Knights Templar, fierce and brave, fell like autumn leaves under the hooves of the Muslim soldiers. Many of the leaders, barons, and thousands of soldiers and knights surrendered, and a few hundred fled to the city of Tyre, seeking refuge behind its walls. The king of Jerusalem, Lusignan, Prince Balian, and the criminal Arnot, whom Saladin killed with his own hand, were captured. Saladin swore an oath saying, "I swore twice to kill him if I captured him, once when he planned to march to Mecca and Medina, and the second when he looted the caravan and took it treacherously." Then Saladin pardoned Balian, allowing him to return to Jerusalem on the condition that he would not stay more than one night. But upon reaching the city, Balian was urged by its people to stay and defend it. He worked to raise the morale of the disheartened soldiers and fortified the city walls in preparation for Saladin's imminent approach, as his path to Jerusalem was now clear. However, Saladin, a seasoned leader, recognized the need to liberate the coastal cities before Jerusalem to prevent them from becoming defensive pockets against him in the future. He liberated Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Byblos, and all the coastal cities except Tyre, believing that its liberation would take too long, so he left it and headed towards Jerusalem, laying siege to it and offering its people safety and the protection of their lives in exchange for surrender. However, they refused, fearing betrayal by the Muslims and retaliation, similar to the Crusaders' actions when they had taken the city. So Saladin began his assault on September 20th, 1187, but Balian put up a fierce defense. Eventually, Muslim soldiers reached the northern wall and breached it. Balian realized that the city would inevitably fall and that continuing the defense would be futile, so he sent an offer of surrender to Saladin, requesting safety and the protection of lives, the same terms that had been offered earlier. Nevertheless, Saladin refused and insisted on unconditional surrender of the city. Balian had no choice but to surrender. Saladin treated the Crusaders with the generosity and kindness that Islam promotes, allowing all its inhabitants, civilians, soldiers, and knights, to leave safely in exchange for a symbolic ransom, covering the cost for those who could not afford it from his own personal funds. Even his enemies testified to his noble actions, recording them in their writings as examples of his generosity and honor. When the news reached Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph sent him a plaque inscribed with the words of Allah, "And we wrote in the Psalms, after the reminder, that the earth is inherited by my righteous servants." Saladin entered Jerusalem on October 2nd, 1187, praising God for granting victory to Islam and the Muslims, and for cleansing and liberating Al-Aqsa after it had been under Crusader occupation for 88 years. The flag of Islam waved high in the sky of Jerusalem, confirming that victory only comes through the swords of jihad and that submission to the enemy results in humiliation and regret. That historic moment stood as the crowning achievement of a long and arduous struggle, culminating in the immortal Battle of Hattin and sealed by the triumphant recovery of Jerusalem. Saladin entered the Holy City, bringing to an end 88 years of Crusader occupation. He immediately set about purifying Al-Masjid al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock from all vestiges of Crusader presence. He ordered the removal of the massive cross that had loomed atop the dome, dismantled the partition wall that had split the mosque into sections, and restored its sacred space with sumptuous carpets and gilded lamps. Once again, its doors were opened to Muslim worshippers after being closed to them for decades. And despite his overwhelming military victory, he sought no revenge. Whereas the Crusaders had massacred tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews during their conquest of Jerusalem in the year 1099, Saladin chose the path of clemency. He displayed exceptional wisdom in his treatment of the city's inhabitants, proclaiming a general amnesty for all. He allowed the Eastern Christians Orthodox to remain in the city and permitted the Western Crusaders Catholics to depart in safety upon the payment of a modest ransom, a fee from which thousands of the impoverished were exempted. He even granted noble Crusaders the opportunity to sell their possessions before departure and guaranteed them a safe passage to the coastal towns. In doing so, Saladin inscribed a singular chapter in the annals of history. As the liberation of Jerusalem was not merely a conventional military liberation, it was a testament to transforming martial triumph into a model of humane governance. Through his actions, he established new principles for dealing with liberated cities, principles rooted in compassion, guided by wisdom, and elevated by the highest forms of tolerance. These ideals earned him reverence across generations of historians, both Eastern and Western. None expressed this more poignantly than the distinguished English historian Stephen Runciman, who in his renowned work, A History of the Crusades, described Saladin's conduct as a unique example of chivalry in an age dominated by cruelty. Indeed, even some contemporary European sources, despite their inherent bias, were compelled to acknowledge his mercy and nobility, which far surpassed the norms of his era. Today, more than 8 full centuries later, that moment in history continues to stand as a shining reminder that the most profound victories are not etched by swords, but by the enduring imprint of values upon the human spirit. It reminds us that true strength lies in the harmony between martial valor and moral integrity, in the balance between defending one's rights and embracing the tenets of religious tolerance, between the exigencies of war and the aspirations of peace. Thus, it may rightly be said that the liberation of Jerusalem, under the leadership of Saladin, transcended its historical context to become a universal human model, one that should be offered to all of humanity today. It is a message of hope affirming that the most meaningful triumphs are those that leave behind a legacy of humanity, preserved in the memory of generations as a lesson in enlightened leadership, one that knows when to fight, how to prevail, and why to forgive. Not long after that resounding victory, the remnants of the Crusaders gathered in the city of Tyre, setting the stage for a new chapter in the saga of the Crusades and reshaping the map of conflict for years to come. As after a siege that lasted 7 months, Saladin was compelled to withdraw, redirecting his efforts toward Jerusalem. Thus, Tyre remained the sole defensive enclave along the Levantine coast, a thorn embedded deep in the side of the Islamic world. Following the crushing Crusader defeat at the Battle of Hattin, Tyre became the destination for waves of surviving knights, dispossessed nobles whose fortresses had fallen, and scattered soldiers who saw in the city their last refuge, their final bastion of hope. Conrad of Montferrat took command, rallying the forces and strengthening the city's defenses, taking full advantage of its unique geographical position, an island tethered to the mainland by a narrow isthmus. He forged alliances with the naval powers of Pisa and Genoa, temporarily securing maritime supremacy and transforming Tyre into a strategic cornerstone of the Third Crusade. It was from there that the armies of Europe, led by the King of England, Richard I, famed as Richard the Lionheart, prepared for a renewed campaign to reclaim Jerusalem. As for the Knights Templar, fate held for them an ominous surprise, one they had never foreseen, a horror beyond even their darkest and most terrifying nightmares. After the Knights Templar officially received recognition for their order in 1129, they worked diligently, combining monasticism with chivalry. 10 years later, in 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull known as the Donation of Perfection, granting the Templars special privileges, including exemption from taxes, and absolving them from local laws or any authority other than the Pope himself. This greatly increased their financial power, and their branches spread throughout Europe. They built castles and cathedrals, established an investment network that dominated the economy of medieval Europe, and were even described as the first capitalists. They became a power within a power, or in modern terms, like a lobby with influence on decision-makers. However, the main source of their wealth remained a question. It was illogical for donations alone to create such a vast financial empire. Yet the central question remained, what was the true source of this immense wealth? It was hardly plausible that donations alone could have forged such a vast financial empire, even with the presence of shadowy investments and covert business deals that secured an unprecedented degree of financial influence in European history. This opens the door to compelling hypotheses. Could some of this wealth trace its origins to a mysterious legacy? And do the Knights Templar still have spiritual heirs orchestrating events from behind the scenes? Militarily, they remained an elite force in the Crusader army, legendary for their bravery, until Saladin crushed their strength, and they fell like autumn leaves under the hooves of the Muslim cavalry at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Some managed to flee alongside the Crusaders to Tyre and then to Acre, where they later moved their headquarters. Before this, however, They had found what they were searching for beneath Al-Aqsa. Though not definitively proven, many indications suggest that the Templars were deeply interested in searching for religious artifacts, and their mission to protect the pilgrims was likely a cover for systematic and methodical excavation operations based on a plan drawn for them by their deity. Indeed, they are believed to have found something that later became the subject of stories mixing fact and fiction. After the liberation of Jerusalem, Saladin entered the city on October 2, 1187, bringing an end to Crusader dominance in the east. The Crusaders were left with only Antioch, Tripoli, and Tyre, where the defeated Crusaders had fled. King Lusignan of Jerusalem also sought refuge there, after being pardoned by Saladin. The news of the Muslims' consecutive victories hit the Christian world like a thunderclap, and the liberation of Jerusalem caused a massive shock to the Europeans, who believed that Jerusalem was the kingdom of heaven granted to them by God and that they were the rightful rulers. However, God had forsaken them for some reason, allowing it to slip from their hands. Even the Knights Templar were not immune to this psychological blow, and it is said that it led to a radical ideological shift for them, from belief in God to the worship of Satan. However, some theories suggest that this ideological shift may have preceded the official founding of the organization itself. According to certain accounts, the seeds of this doctrinal deviation were sown during the earliest stages of recruitment and formation, when individuals from obscure backgrounds, possibly linked to ancient pagan rituals and secret traditions prevalent in the East during the Crusades, were drawn into the ranks. Some researchers propose that during their extended stay in Jerusalem, the Knights Templar engaged in arcane studies and clandestine excavations beneath the Temple Mount, where they are believed to have discovered esoteric texts and manuscripts. These writings allegedly contained elements of dark magic and the worship of shadowy entities, which profoundly altered their worldview and conception of the divine. As a result, they became immersed in a complex symbolic system where religious tenets intersected with occult knowledge, and public allegiance was overshadowed by hidden loyalties. Pope Urban III collapsed and died upon hearing the news of the Muslim victory at Hattin. He was succeeded by Gregory VIII, who declared that the Muslim capture of Jerusalem was a punishment from God for the Christians due to their sins. He then called for the Third Crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Meanwhile, the Crusaders who had gathered in Tyre united their ranks and headed to Acre, where they laid siege for 2 full years. Just as Peter the Hermit had once ridden his donkey to stir public anger and call for participation in the First Crusade, Catholic clergymen now traveled through markets, stirring emotions and encouraging people to defend Christian holy sites desecrated by the Muslims. England and France put aside their historical differences and ended the ongoing war between them in preparation to face the Muslims. King Henry II of England and King Philip II of France imposed a tax on their people known as the Saladin tithe, requiring 10% of wealth and property to fund preparations for the Third Crusade. The German Emperor, Frederick I Barbarossa, also joined the campaign. Thus, 3 of the greatest kings of Europe prepared for the Crusade, earning it the title of the Crusade of Kings. Frederick Barbarossa led a large army, marching through Hungary toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire at the time. The Byzantine Emperor, Isaac II Angelos, sent word to Saladin, promising that he would not allow the German army to pass. His aim was to avoid confronting the strength of the Muslim army and to maintain the sacred sites in the Levant under the protection of the Orthodox Church, rather than allowing them to fall under the rule of the Western Catholic Church. But after the Germans besieged Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor was forced to allow Frederick's army to cross the Dardanelles and continue their march through Anatolia until they reached Iconium. However, Frederick died along the way, and much of the army returned to the Holy Roman Empire, while his son led the remainder of the forces toward Antioch and then to Acre via Tyre. Meanwhile, the English and French armies prepared to march eastward. However, before the English army could set off, Henry II of England passed away, and his son Richard I, known by the name Richard the Lionheart, succeeded him on the throne of England. Richard led the fleet of the Crusade across the Mediterranean Sea to support the siege of Acre. On the way, the English besieged the island of Cyprus, which had separated from the Byzantine Empire, and seized it. Instead of returning it to the Byzantine Empire, Richard sold it to the Knights Templar. In the summer of 1191, after a prolonged siege and tightening the noose on the city both by land and sea, the Crusaders managed to capture Acre. Richard then continued his march to Jaffa and sent word to Saladin, requesting a meeting to sign an agreement between them. Saladin refused to meet until Richard agreed to a peace treaty that would end the campaign and free the Muslim prisoners. When Richard refused and ordered the execution of 2,700 prisoners, Saladin's army confronted the Crusaders at Arsuf, north of Jaffa. However, Richard's military acumen led to a crushing defeat for the Muslims, and the Crusaders took control of Jaffa. Saladin then retreated to fortify Jerusalem. Richard's desire to meet with Saladin stemmed from the unstable political situation in England at the time. Some historians have mentioned that King Richard harbored animosity toward the Jews and ordered massacres against them. While this has not been definitively proven, behind the scenes, plots were being hatched against him, similar to what would later happen with Hitler centuries afterward. Richard felt that his throne was in jeopardy and thus reluctantly entered negotiations with Saladin, with negotiations being led on the Muslim side by King Aladil. However, the initial negotiations failed, and the Crusaders continued their march toward Jerusalem. But when news from England reached Richard that his brother John Lackland was conspiring against him, he was forced to sign a treaty with Saladin, known as the Treaty of Ramla, in 1192. The main provisions of the treaty stated that Jerusalem would remain under Muslim rule, while Christian merchants and pilgrims would be allowed to visit the city. In return, the Crusaders retained control of the coastal cities, Tyre, Acre, Haifa, Caesarea, Arsuf, and Jaffa. Thus, the Third Crusade ended with a result that was unsatisfactory for both sides. Despite the Crusade's success in capturing Acre and Jaffa, it failed to achieve its primary goal of reclaiming Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was disappointed by Saladin's failure to retain control over the coastal cities, which allowed the Crusaders to re-establish their foothold in the east along the coast from Tyre to Jaffa, in addition to Tripoli and Antioch. In the following year, 1193, King Saladin fell ill and passed away shortly after. The rule of the Ayyubid state was divided among his successors. His eldest son, El-Afdal Nur al-Din, ruled Damascus, Jerusalem, and Baalbek. His son, Al-Aziz Osman, ruled Egypt. His third son, Al-Zahir Ghazi, ruled Aleppo and northern Syria. As for his brother, King Aladil, he ruled Jordan, Kerak, Jazira, and Diyarbakir. The remaining parts of the state were distributed among his other children, brothers, and family members. However, they soon entered into conflicts driven by ambitions, and they kept attacking each other until King Aladil was able to firmly seize control and reunite the Ayyubid state under his rule. He enlisted the help of his sons in administering it, appointing his son Al-Kamil Muhammad in Egypt, Al-Muazzam Isa in Damascus, and Al-Ashraf Musa in Haran. Meanwhile, Leopold V, Duke of Austria, had captured Richard the Lionheart and later released him for a large ransom. Richard returned to England in 1194 and eventually died in 1199. Throughout these years, the Christian world remained dissatisfied with the outcome of the Third Crusade, which prompted Pope Innocent III to call for a Fourth Crusade in 1202 to achieve the goal that the Third Crusade had failed to accomplish. As Europe watched with growing unease the aftermath of the Third Crusade, fractures began to emerge within the Crusader camp itself, triggering conflict among the competing European powers. Amid this climate of political and military disarray, the Knights Templars seized the opportunity to expand their influence. They capitalized on the prevailing instability to strengthen their position, increasing their presence across the Crusader states and deepening their alliances with local and feudal powers. Bolstered by substantial financial support from Europe and an extensive transnational network, the Templars gradually evolved from a purely religious military order into a formidable economic and intelligence force that commanded strategic consideration across Christendom. At this time, the Knights Templar had moved their headquarters from Jerusalem to Acre. And while their military power in the east had weakened, their economic power grew significantly in the west. However, the same question continued to echo. What was the source of their vast wealth? Neither the donations nor their skill in financial management could explain how they had transformed from an organization symbolized by two knights riding one horse, signifying poverty, into an organization that could lend to kings and princes. Although this question remains unanswered to this day, most suspicions point to the fact that they discovered a hidden treasure beneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was the key to their rise and their dramatic fall. It is said that they discovered the Shroud of Turin, the cloth in which Jesus Christ was wrapped after his crucifixion, according to their belief. However, this piece of cloth, which has been preserved since 1578 in the Cathedral of San Giovanni in Turin, Italy, underwent independent carbon-14 tests in 1988, and researchers dated it to between 1260 and 1390, meaning it does not belong to the time of Jesus Christ. Believers, however, defended its authenticity, arguing that it had undergone restoration at some point. It is also said that they discovered the Holy Grail, which, according to Christian mythology, is the cup used by Jesus Christ during the Last Supper when he gathered with his disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. It is said that during this meeting, he instituted what is known as the Eucharist, or the Holy Communion, one of the 7 sacred rites, the teachings and rituals that aim to obtain an invisible grace through a visible grace. The importance of the Holy Grail lies in the belief that it holds miraculous powers derived from Christ himself, as it is believed to have contained his blood. Although this fascinating story resembles the legends of the Celtic peoples who lived in Central Europe during the Iron Age, the Holy Grail has an even more intriguing story. The third and perhaps most enigmatic discovery attributed to the Knights Templar is the teachings known as the Kabbalah. This is a mystical and esoteric Judaic system concerned with interpreting the universe, the divine, and creation through deeply symbolic and metaphysical lenses, radically different from traditional religious doctrines. It is believed that these teachings were once preserved in secret manuscripts, passed down orally among a select circle of priests and sages, until it fell into the hands of the Templars during their time in Jerusalem. For the Templars, the encounter with Kabbalistic knowledge was a profound intellectual and spiritual shock. It opened gateways to concepts they had never encountered before: the higher realms, the secret names of God, parallel universes, and the laws of energy and manifestation. Over time, it is said that some members of the order adopted these mystical ideas as part of a new esoteric doctrine, gradually distancing themselves from Orthodox Catholic beliefs and engaging in spiritual and magical practices deemed heretical by the Church. Some historians argue that the Templars' engagement with the Kabbalah went beyond theoretical exploration and was transformed into practical elements embedded in their rituals, eventually becoming one of the foundational pillars that nourished later European secret societies, such as the Illuminati and Freemasonry. Pope Innocent III succeeded in launching the Fourth Crusade, and the armies were prepared to head east with the aim of recovering Jerusalem from Muslim hands. It seems that the leaders of the Crusade recognized that the power of the Muslims lay within the Ayyubid state, and the center of gravity for this state was Egypt. Therefore, the path to Jerusalem must begin with the overthrow of the Ayyubids at their stronghold, followed by the establishment of Egypt as a base for launching into the Levant. However, this crusade took a strange turn. Instead of heading to Egypt, the Crusaders besieged the city of Zadra in 1202, a Catholic Christian city located on the Adriatic coast within present-day Croatia. After capturing it, widespread killings and looting ensued. The crusade then moved to Constantinople to support the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos against his brother, who had deposed him and declared himself emperor. They restored Isaac to the throne, and his son, Alexios IV Angelos, became the de facto ruler. He had promised the Crusaders a financial reward in exchange for their support. When he failed to honor this promise, the Crusaders seized Constantinople in 1204, looted it, and committed mass killings against its inhabitants. This incited outrage among the Christian world, as comparisons were drawn between the actions of the Crusaders against their fellow Christians and what Saladin had done after the liberation of Jerusalem, where its inhabitants, including the leaders and fighters, were allowed to leave safely. The Crusaders settled in Constantinople and divided the Byzantine Empire into 3 empires, while also establishing a fourth. This sparked wars between them and the Bulgarians and Byzantines, which lasted until 1261, when the Byzantine Empire regained its status. However, these conflicts weakened the Byzantine Empire, paving the way for its eventual conquest by the Muslims nearly 2 centuries later. Although the Fourth Crusade strayed from its primary objective and deepened the Great Schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Catholic Church, the successors of Saladin, who divided the Ayyubid state between Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, remained divided and conflicted among themselves. Pope Innocent III recognized that the Islamic state was in a state of weakness and fragmentation, so he hastily called for a Fifth Crusade in 1213 to achieve the same goal that the Fourth Crusade had failed to reach, the recovery of Jerusalem. However, Innocent III died before the crusade could begin, and he was succeeded by Honorius III. In 1217, a large Crusader army gathered in Acre, which included the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar. In the following year, 1218, the Crusaders arrived at Damietta and laid siege to it for a year and a half. Sultan Al-Kamil made a strange offer to the Crusaders. He would lift the siege on Damietta in exchange for the surrender of Jerusalem. However, the Pope's representative, who was essentially the supreme commander of the Crusader forces, arrogantly rejected the offer, declaring that there could be no peace with the infidels and that they must occupy Damietta and all of Egypt. And in 1219, the Crusaders successfully occupied Damietta, and as usual, they brutally killed its inhabitants and looted the city. They then continued their march toward Mansoura. Sultan Al-Kamil continued to offer the Crusaders a deal to leave Egypt in exchange for the surrender of Jerusalem, despite it being a symbol of the conflict. However, they repeatedly rejected it arrogantly until the annual Nile flood occurred. The bridges were opened, and the roads were flooded. Meanwhile, Sultan Al-Kamil allied with his brothers, Al-Muazzam Isa and Al-Ashraf Musa, and the Muslim army laid siege to the Crusaders, cutting off their route of retreat and isolating them from their base in Damietta. Faced with these developments, the Crusaders had no choice but to surrender. The crusade withdrew to Damietta and then returned to Europe, dragging the shame of failure. The alliance of the 3 brothers, sons of King Al-Adil, did not last long after the departure of the Fifth Crusade, and soon conflict broke out between Al-Muazzam Isa and Sultan Al-Kamil. Al-Muazzam Isa sought the help of Sultan Jalal al-Din Khwarazmi, ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, while Sultan al-Kamil sought the support of Emperor Frederick II of Germany and Sicily, who was known for his sympathy towards Muslims, making him a target of suspicion from the Church. The Vatican even threatened him with excommunication, separation from the Church, and prohibition from participating in religious rites due to his repeated promises to lead a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem but delaying it. However, at the request of Sultan al-Kamil, Frederick II led the Sixth Crusade alone in 1228, which was described as the most surprising of the Crusades. It was the only crusade to leave without the Pope's blessing, and it consisted of only 600 knights, carried by a modest fleet. The goal was to assist Sultan al-Kamil, who had promised Frederick Jerusalem in exchange for his help against his brother Al-Muazzam Isa. When this small army arrived in Acre, Al-Muazzam Isa had already died, and his lands were divided between his brothers. Thus, the goal for which Frederick had come was no longer valid. Nevertheless, Sultan al-Kamil simply handed over Jerusalem to Frederick without hesitation. Thus, Frederick II achieved the ancient Crusader dream without the support of the Church, without battle, and without shedding a single drop of blood, relying solely on the weakness, negligence, and disregard of Sultan al-Kamil, who handed over Jerusalem to the Crusaders for free, as if he did not recognize its value or the sacrifices made by men who gave their lives to liberate it. Jerusalem remained under Crusader control as internal conflicts within the Ayyubid dynasty intensified, lasting until Sultan al-Kamil's death in 1238, and King al-Nasir Dawud, the son of Al-Muazzam Isa, managed to liberate Jerusalem in the following year, 1239, to rectify what his negligent uncle had corrupted. However, the internal conflicts within the Ayyubid house continued. In 1240, Al-Salih Ismail, the son of King Al-Adil, allied himself with the Crusaders against Al-Salih Najm al-Din Ayyub, the son of Sultan al-Kamil, and ceded to them all the lands west of the Jordan River, including Jerusalem. Thus, Jerusalem returned to the Crusaders once again on a silver platter, due to the fighting among the weak Muslim rulers who were pursuing their personal ambitions. Before this time, the Khwarezmian state, which had replaced the Seljuks, faced a decisive confrontation with another powerful state founded by the Mongols in Central Asia. The Mongol Empire expanded its territories at the expense of the Chinese Empire and even controlled Beijing by 1215, and a confrontation between the Mongols and the Khwarezmians became inevitable. In 1219, the Mongols invaded the Khwarezmian state, and the city of Acre fell into their hands, followed by Bokhara and Samarkand. The Khwarezmian state collapsed, and its remaining soldiers scattered. However, Al-Salih Ayyub recruited them, and with their help, he was able to defeat the Crusaders at the Battle of Gaza, also known as the Battle of La Fourbi, in 1244. Jerusalem was regained and finally returned to the embrace of the Islamic world, never to be lost again until the early 20th century, when the descendants of the Samaritans succeeded in occupying it until today. In a paradox of fate, Gaza became also the final sword bearing the banner of jihad in our modern times, with the hope of liberating Jerusalem. The Christian world did not stand idly by in the face of the victories of the Ayyubids and Khwarezmians. In 1249, they launched the seventh and final crusade, led by King Louis IX of France, with the blessing of Pope Innocent IV. The Crusaders attempted to persuade the Mongols to ally with them to encircle the Islamic world, but the Mongols rejected the offer, as they had their own plans. The crusade embarked with a large fleet, and several Crusader barons from the Levant, along with the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar, sailed from Acre to join the campaign in Cyprus before heading toward Egypt. It is worth mentioning that Frederick II, who had been at odds with the church, sent news of the crusade to Sultan Najm al-Din Ayyub, giving him the opportunity to prepare for the confrontation. However, at that time, Sultan Najm al-Din was ill, and when the Crusader army landed on the shores of Damietta, the Egyptian army commander Fakhr al-Din Yusuf mistakenly believed that the Sultan had died and withdrew from the defensive line, allowing the Crusaders to enter Damietta without resistance. When Sultan Najm al-Din learned of this, he was furious. He was carried ill to the palace in Mansoura and declared a general mobilization in Egypt. The common people gathered for defense. They courageously infiltrated the Crusader camp, killing and capturing many, so much so that historians mention that the Crusaders feared the volunteers from the general population more than the soldiers themselves. A few months later, reinforcements arrived from France, emboldening the Crusaders, who decided to march toward Alexandria. However, Louis IX chose to advance toward Cairo. When the army reached the outskirts of Mansoura, Sultan Najm al-Din Ayyub died. His wife, Shajar al-Dur, hid the news to maintain the morale of the soldiers and sent for Najm al-Din's son, Turan Shah, who ruled the city of Qais and Kifa, to lead the country. In early 1250, a division led by King Louis's brother, supported by an English contingent and a force of Knights Templar, launched a fierce attack on the Muslim army, defeating them. Fakhr al-Din Yusuf, the Egyptian commander, was killed, and the soldiers were scattered, retreating to take shelter behind the walls of Mansoura. However, the Crusader divisions followed them, falling into an ambush set by the new commander, Faris al-Din Iqtay, based on a plan by Prince Baybars al-Bun Duktari, luring the Crusaders into the city. The plan succeeded, and the Crusader divisions entered the streets and alleys of Mansoura, only to find the city completely empty. Suddenly, the Mamluk soldiers, along with local Arabs and commoners, sprang from their ambushes and attacked the Crusaders, nearly annihilating them. So the Crusader army retreated in panic toward Damietta. But the Muslims pursued them, and near the city of Farskar, they wiped them out, capturing Louis IX and several princes and nobles. Louis IX was imprisoned in Dar ibn Luqman until he was released in exchange for a ransom of 400,000 dinars. He paid half of it and promised to pay the remainder upon reaching Acre, but he never fulfilled this promise. Louis IX stayed in Acre for 4 years among the Knights Templar, calling on the Christian world to send reinforcements so that he could resume his failed campaign, but no one responded to him. It seems that at that time, the Christian world began to enter a new era of awareness, finally realizing that this land is the graveyard of invaders and that its conquest must be achieved through means other than the sword. With the end of the Seventh Crusade, the countdown to the Crusader presence in Muslim lands began, and the Mamluks became the backbone of the Egyptian army. They were descendants of soldiers, most of whom came from Anatolia, and were brought as children and sold in slave markets. However, the Muslim sultans treated them almost as their own children, and they received religious education from scholars and training in combat and horsemanship. Thus, they grew into strong, pious, and courageous fighters, earning the title Dawiya of Islam, from historians, likening them to the Crusaders, namely the Knights Templar. Despite Egypt falling into political chaos after the departure of the Seventh Crusade, the Mamluks managed to restore security, tighten their grip on the country, and end the era of the Ayyubid dynasty. They ruled Egypt directly for nearly 3 centuries and indirectly under the Ottomans for over 3 more centuries. After the last Crusaders departed, Turan Shah was killed, and the Mamluks pledged allegiance to the widow of Najm al-Din Ayyub, Shajar al-Dur, as ruler of Egypt. But when she faced rejection from the Abbasid Caliphate and Muslim scholars, she was forced to relinquish the throne after only 80 days to her new husband, Izz-al-Din Aibak. Later after his death, his young son took the throne. Soon after, the situation stabilized for Emir Saif al-Din Qutuz, who became the de facto ruler of the country. He issued a general amnesty for the Mamluks, who had fled to the Levant after the death of their leader Faris al-Din Acre, and thus al-Zahir Baybars returned to Egypt. It wasn't long before the Mongols knocked on the doors of the Islamic world. After they defeated the Khwarezmian state, they succeeded in wiping out the assassin sect at their stronghold in Alamut Castle, north of modern-day Iran. This achievement was notable, as they accomplished what the Muslims had failed to do for centuries. In 1258, the Mongols invaded Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. They destroyed the city, massacred its inhabitants, and burned the House of Wisdom along with its valuable and priceless manuscripts, throwing the remaining texts into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They then moved on to Aleppo, where the city's fate was no different from Baghdad's. Next, they turned to Damascus, where its ruler Al-Nasir Yusuf al-Ayyubi fled, and the city surrendered. A sense of despair overtook the Ayyubid rulers in the Levant, and they supported the idea of surrendering to the Mongols. Baybars denounced this and said his famous words, "You are the cause of the Muslims' destruction." And when the Mongol envoys arrived in Egypt with a letter of threat demanding that Qutuz surrender, he did not flinch. He killed the envoys and hung their heads on the gate of Zawila. Then he led the Mamluk army from Egypt and met the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, defeating them and halting their advance into the Islamic world. However, on his return to Cairo, Saif al-Din Qutuz was assassinated, and he was succeeded by King al-Zahir Rukn al-Din Baybars, who dedicated his life to jihad against the Crusaders, announcing a new era of revival for the age of Saladin and powerful Muslim leaders. Baybars did not accept reconciliation with the Crusaders in the Levant, and he waged wars against them, bringing down their castles one after another. He succeeded in recapturing Caesarea, then Jaffa, and Arsuf. His victories continued until he succeeded in recapturing Antioch in the year 1268. However, Acre remained difficult due to the strength of its fortifications and the desperate defense of the Knights Templar. When Baybars passed away, another strong knight succeeded him, Al-Mansur Kalawan, who continued the path of jihad, bringing down many Crusader castles until he succeeded in liberating Tripoli in 1289. The following year, Al-Mansur Kalawan died, and his son Al-Ashraf Khalil succeeded him. He continued his father's path and decided to retake Acre and expel the Crusaders from their last stronghold in the east. So the 21st Grand Master of the Knights Templar, William of Beaujeu, sent him a delegation laden with gifts to persuade him to abandon his march toward Acre. However, Al-Ashraf Khalil refused to meet the delegation, mobilized the armies of Egypt and the Levant, and laid siege to Acre by land and sea. Despite the fierce defense of the Hospitaller Knights and the Knights Templar, the Muslim army pounded the city with trebuchets, and the towers began to fall one after another. On the morning of Friday, the 18th of May, in the year 1291, the full-scale attack on the city began, and the Muslim army was able to enter it. Violent street battles took place during which the leader of the Knights Templar was killed, and the Muslims regained the city except for the Templar castle. The new leader of the organization fled with some of his knights, carrying their money and gold. Soon after the castle fell, Acre was liberated, and the Knights Templar fled on ships towards Cyprus, relocating their headquarters to the city El-Limassol. However, they attempted to maintain a garrison on the Syrian island of Arwud. In the year 1300, they formed an alliance with the Mongols, but the Mamluks were able to defeat them and expel them from Arwud, thus ending their presence in the east. The Crusader presence was extinguished, and the land of Islam was purified from these devils. But devils never tire, and neither do they forget. Similarly, the Crusaders and the Knights Templar did not forget that it was Saladin who had humiliated them. More than 7 centuries later, after the British Mandate over Palestine in 1920 and the entry of the French into Damascus, a French commander in World War I, General Henri Gouraud, went directly to Saladin's tomb and said his famous words, "Awake, Saladin, we have returned." As the military power of the Knights Templar waned, their Western support also began to diminish. However, the dream of returning to the East still haunted them, so they sought to mobilize the armies of Europe. Yet, Europe at that time was preoccupied with internal conflicts and had begun to partially liberate itself from the control of the church and religious rule, signaling the approaching end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance. The Knights Templar thus turned their attention more to the economic side than to the military one. However, their retention of legal privileges sparked the ire of European nobles and kings, especially after rumors spread that the Knights Templar were planning to establish an independent religious state. According to historians, King Philip IV of France owed a massive debt to the organization, which he had borrowed to finance his wars against England. He exploited these rumors and led a fierce campaign, along with his right-hand man and the Kingdom of France's chief lawyer, William of Nogaret, accusing the Knights Templar of practices that contradicted Christian faith, such as heresy, denying or altering parts of the doctrine or introducing new beliefs. Nogaret held a deep hatred for the papacy, as he had witnessed the burning of his parents alive under the orders of the church and the supervision of the Knights Templar during his childhood. Therefore, he did not hesitate to take revenge. In a short time, these rumors or facts spread among the public. So, just as the Knights Templar had risen swiftly, they also fell just as fast, transforming from the most respected organization, known as the Soldiers of Christ, into one of the most despised, accused of abandoning Christianity and worshipping the idol, Baphomet. Interestingly, some historians mention that the name Baphomet first appeared in a letter from a Crusader soldier in 1098, in which he stated that they prayed to Baphomet for victory over the Muslims during the First Crusade, even before the establishment of the Knights Templar itself. Philip IV succeeded in stirring public opinion and the church against the Knights Templar. In 1307, he issued an order to arrest the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, and several members of the organization. They were subjected to trials, which began with the statement, "God is not pleased with us. We have enemies of the faith in our kingdom." The Knights Templar faced charges of atheism, idol worship, especially the idol Baphomet, heresy, practicing prostitution in their rituals, homosexuality, spitting on a cross, fraud, and dozens of other charges. They confessed to these charges under torture, as is claimed, and these confessions were recorded and are now preserved in the National Archives in Paris. Thus, the Knights Templar were condemned, and the organization was officially dissolved. Then Pope Clement V issued a decree calling on all European kings to arrest the Knights Templar and seize their property. In 1314, Jacques de Molay and some leaders were burned at the stake, while others were imprisoned. The surviving Knights Templar became fugitives throughout Europe. So many of them fled to Scotland, which was then struggling for independence from England and was not subject to the authority of the church. Thus, Philip IV was able to free himself from his debts and dreamed of seizing the organization's wealth and treasures. However, when the French soldiers entered the Knights' castle, they found no trace of the treasure, leaving one of the greatest mysteries of this story unresolved. In Scotland, a new and fascinating chapter began in the life of the Knights Templar. A short time before this, Scotland had entered a state of political chaos, which enabled the King of England, Edward I, to invade and occupy it, annexing it to the English crown in the year 1296. This led to a wave of protests in the country, which soon escalated into a revolution led by Andrew Moray and William Wallace, who succeeded in forming a small army that managed to inflict several defeats on the English, the most famous of which was the Battle of Stirling Bridge, which made Wallace the guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland and its army commander. However, the English later managed to defeat the Scots at the Battle of Falkirk, and King Edward's men continued to pursue Wallace until they captured him in 1305, and he was executed. With the death of William Wallace, the English tightened their grip on the country, and it seemed as though the revolution had been quelled. However, the arrival of the Knights Templar, who had fled after the collapse of their organization, breathed new life into the spirit of resistance. They allied with the King of Scotland, Robert the Bruce, and fought a series of battles against England known as the Wars of Scottish Independence, which paved the way for the Knights Templar to later rule the largest country in the world. They then ruled the entire world after managing to conceal themselves under a new name, which remained unknown for centuries, until suddenly it appeared and filled the sights and ears of the world in our present time. After Scotland gained independence in 1357, the Knights Templar were able to infiltrate English society, where they established one of the largest organizations there, naming it Freemasonry. They worked in secrecy until after 4 centuries, they were able to ignite the flames of the French Revolution, avenging the execution of their leaders. You might think that we have ventured deep into history and that we have diverged onto many paths. However, this journey was necessary to pick up scattered threads that will help us weave a fabric that combines parts of the picture to make it clearer. Finally, it is worth noting that although historians disagree greatly on the origins of the Knights Templar and their branches, they often reach opposing conclusions, especially starting from that mysterious period in history. This is because the world only learned about Freemasonry and its plans from the Freemasons themselves after they reached a level of power that allowed them to emerge into the open. However, they were, and still are, so clever that they master the art of obfuscation, manipulating symbols, and mixing truths with lies to ensure no one could link the threads or merge the scattered pieces of the picture. Hence, numerous speculations and contradictory narratives have arisen, and interpretations have diverged. But we will attempt to gather the pieces of the story and organize them logically, hoping that we can understand how the descendants of the Samaritans succeeded in concealing the sun and constructing that diabolical matrix in which most of the world's population lives today.